Hey folks, in this video I'm going to show you how to take flat, boring scenes like these and turn them into something punchy and striking in Unity. Art can't fix a bad game, but it can boost a good one, and luckily it's not too difficult to create solid visuals nowadays, even if you're not an artist. I hear from programmers all the time who want to get into making games, but worry that they don't have the art chops to make something visually interesting. Before getting into games, my background was in software development, so in this video, I want to show you how you can create beautiful visuals without necessarily needing to know 3D modeling and texturing. Because here's the thing, if you already know how to write a little bit of code, then you actually have a superpower, shaders. But more on that later. I'm currently doing some art prototypes for my next game, and I threw together 2 basic scenes to play with, but you could totally imagine grabbing these from an asset pack. Now let's create some striking and performant visuals in Unity's URP through shaders, post-processing, lighting, reflections, and just a dash of code to bring some life to these static scenes. The first thing we need to do is decide on our art direction. For the first scene, I'm going to go with a textured, relatively realistic art style, which can actually be much simpler than something stylized. Realism is great if you're using assets, because for the most part, it's much easier to keep consistent, and you'll find a ton of freely available realistic textures to work with from sites like Ambient CG and Textures.com. The lit shader provided by Unity is PBR based, which of course stands for Professional Bull Riders. Nope. Physically based rendering. This means it aims to offer realistic lighting and surface properties, so it's a solid starting point for a realistic scene. A stylized art style is more work up front, as we have to be a bit more intentional with crafting our art direction and writing all of our shaders. For my game, Farewell North, it took me about 2 years to really nail down the art style, but it can be a really great way to mask some of your artistic limitations. If I'm honest, the uncolored world in Farewell North was originally a tool to mask my inability to create textures at the time, and allowed me to slowly learn texturing over the years. We'll stick with realism for the first scene, but we'll write some shaders of our own to add some artistic flair like volumetric lights. Once we're done with that, we'll create a more stylized art style for the second scene, which doesn't rely on textures and leans much more into tech art. Let's go! I filled out the scene with some freely available textures from Ambient CG. We'll write some shaders of our own later, but there are 3 tricks I want to quickly run through for getting the most out of the default lit shader. First up, the detail inputs allow us to overlay additional textures on top of the base shading. I like to use this to add a little bit of noise, maybe simulating some dirt or wear and tear over top. You could bake this into the main texture in Photoshop, but what's nice about doing it this way is that we can break up repetitive tiling and control the intensity of the detail at runtime. Maybe the house gets dirtier as the game progresses, or as the player loses their sanity. You can also provide a mask texture to apply the effect to only certain areas of the surface. Maybe to have the dirt concentrated to the bottom of the wall or to an area that the player has damaged. The height map or parallax map uses some perspective trickery to mimic depth on an otherwise flat surface. This goes much further than a simple normal map, actually appearing to elevate certain portions of the surface based on a grayscale texture where white areas are raised. If you're using textures from Ambient CG or Textures.com, then they'll actually come with the height map textures that you need. They'll also come with occlusion maps. Throughout this video, we're going to apply 3 different types of ambient occlusion, the first being this very simple grayscale image on the material. Ambient occlusion simulates shadows, and this texture in particular is a great way for pre-baking very finely detailed shadows in the cracks and crevices, like in between the wooden planks of our floor. The darker the pixel in the texture, the less light is reaching that point. The base shading is just setting the stage for the lighting and post-processing to come, which will really take things to the next level, so don't worry that it's looking super bland right now. Alright, let's get into the good stuff. Before we get too carried away with the lighting, let's talk a little bit about the goals of this scene. What's the game that we're making? The house is definitely old, maybe it's an old farmhouse, and we can imagine the floorboards creaking beneath our feet as we walk through it. It could be horror, but I feel like making something a bit more vibrant, so let's imagine it's a calm, sunny day, a gentle breeze coming through the window as we explore the house, the sound of leaves and birds reaching us from outside. Maybe it's just the new Superman trailer, but I'm feeling Clark Kent's family home in Kansas vibes. A peaceful, quiet place where we feel safe. Nostalgia, basically. Now, why am I wasting your time with this? Well, lighting does a lot to convey emotion, so when we're lighting a scene, we need to understand what emotion it is we're trying to convey. Are we happy, sad, scared, isolated? Keeping the emotion front of mind will help you craft a scene that supports it, and when you put good sound design on top of it, that's magic. I've positioned the sun so that it comes through the window and it crosses the hallway at an angle, which will give us a nice space for the volumetrics. We're going with a calm summer day motif, so let's get a nice warm orange glow on the directional light, which will act as our sun. It looks a little bit cold right now, but when we write the volumetric lighting shader in a moment, then it'll warm up quite a bit. Let's bake this to get some indirect lighting going, which is going to give us a much richer texture to all of our static surfaces. Here are the settings I'm using. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the main things to note are that I'm using baked indirect, boosting the albedo and indirect intensity, and reducing the skybox intensity as it's quite heavily exposed and we don't really want that ambient lighting blowing up our indoor scene. Once that bakes, we're going to see much improved lighting. What's happened is that we've pre-computed all the light bouncing calculations and stored them into light map textures. sample images for all of our static surfaces, which get sampled in the shader. For now it looks really washed out, almost gray, but don't worry, this is going to be fixed when we do some color grading soon. A lot of devs make the mistake of leaving the shadow strength at 1. This makes the shadows a little bit too dark in my opinion, especially in dimly lit horror games, where it might look fine on your screen, but it ends up being pitch black on many of your players. So dropping that strength just a little bit will help bring out some more detail from your textures that aren't directly lit. This is especially clear with post-processing, again we'll get to that soon. We still want to keep a lot of that shadowy contrast, but dropping just a little bit to say 0.9 usually gives a really good balance. I did include a subtle ambient occlusion in my bake settings, but let's also add a real-time screen space ambient occlusion pass in the URP renderer settings. SSAO fakes dark shadows where surfaces meet and it really grounds the contact point of objects. You can really see this around the mirror and where the bench makes contact with the floor. It's really easy to go too far with SSAO, but here are the settings that I'm using. Now onto my favorite part. I love volumetrics. It's a real simple pleasure to walk through an environment and watch the light shafts flicker between the shadows or the fog roll over the terrain. It just adds so much in my opinion. Thankfully, it's not terribly difficult to implement either. Now we can't do a full-on shader tutorial inside this video, so I'm going to focus on explaining the algorithm and the more interesting bits of the code. If you want to just grab the code and drop it right into your URP project, then I've added the full volumetric lighting implementation and this whole sample scene with all the effects that we'll create in this video to my code bundle for patrons on the Osprey tier. This bundle includes a whole bunch of tools that I use to build games, including my full world streaming solution that I built to handle streaming over 700 scenes in Farewell North, fully optimized to run on platforms like the Nintendo Switch, so check that out if you're interested. But let's go through the core of the implementation so that you can build the effect yourself if you prefer. The algorithm we're going to use for this is called ray marching. It's a fun little algorithm, and the basic idea is that after drawing our scene, for each pixel we cast a ray from the camera towards the world position of the pixel found in the depth buffer. By the way, the depth buffer is just a special image that contains the distance of each pixel from the camera and allows us to calculate its world position. But instead of doing a single ray, we're going to march through the world in steps, starting from the camera and ending at the world position of our pixel, or some max distance if the scene depth is too far. This is just an optimization. At each step, we check if the current world position is in light or in shadow, and we add up all the accumulated light before normalizing this over the number of steps that we took. If we then run this shader in screen space and visualize the accumulated light in the red channel, it's not looking so hot. We have all these jagged edges around the light. This is because we're limiting the number of steps the algorithm can take for performance, which isn't really an accurate representation of how light reaches our eyes. The more steps we allow, the better the result, but the worse the performance. The reason the lack of precision is causing this jagged edge is because it's uniformly lacking, meaning in a given cluster of pixels, they're all getting the same slightly inaccurate result. But what if we introduce a little bit of noise to the simulation, so in a given cluster of pixels, they're all getting slightly different, slightly inaccurate results? Sounds like a bad idea, like it would just make things worse, but in the context of ray marching, this is known as jitter, and it's actually essential to the algorithm. By introducing a little bit of noise, we're able to smooth out the inaccuracies and get a more refined result. Let's go back to where we initialize the start position and add a random offset. As you can see, increasing the jitter value reduces the harshness of the edges without requiring extra steps. We can go too far with the jitter and add too much noise to the simulation, but as long as we keep the jitter reasonable, then it's a solid trade-off between performance and accuracy without banding or harsh edges. It certainly does add noise to the final result, but the good news is that we can actually fix the noise with an optimization, which is always a great bonus. Currently, we're running the ray march algorithm at full resolution for every pixel, every frame. At 1080p, that's over 2 million pixels, and in 4K, that's about 8.3 million pixels. When you factor in the number of steps we're doing per pixel, that is a lot of work. If instead we were to run the algorithm on a downscaled version of the image, say a half or a quarter resolution, then we get progressively more pixelated results, depending on how many times we downscale. That's not particularly useful on its own, but I've added 2 more shader passes to run an optimized Gaussian blur on our downscaled ray march results. Now we can run a variable number of blur passes, and assuming we don't push it too far, our pixelated downsampled version is suddenly quite good. This allows us to keep the ray march steps low, run the algorithm on a smaller image, and get a really satisfying result. For my game Farewell North, I tied these downsample and blur settings to the game's quality settings. So at the highest tiers it ran at half resolution, and on the lowest tiers it ran at a quarter or even an eighth resolution with more blur. Of course, on the lowest tiers, the volumetric lighting was disabled entirely. So this is looking good and it's well optimized, but we're not done yet. Obviously, we can't render the world as this red image. So let's add one final shader pass to composite this onto the color buffer. The ray march buffer we've created, this red texture, tells us the intensity of the light at a given pixel, and we can add that onto the color buffer like so. We don't add red though, we multiply that intensity by the color we want our light to be based on our environment. The color of the sun, in this case. And you can see how this already adds a lot to the atmosphere. and we can move the sun around and the volumetrics happily fill in the space. There's a lot more we can do to improve this implementation, such as scattering, and I've included some of those improvements in the Patreon repo, but this gets us most of the way there. Once again, color grading is really what's going to take this to the next level, but we'll get to that very soon. This method of ray-marched shadow map sampling to create volumetrics is really nice because it's fully dynamic. You don't have to hand create light shafts for every opening and light source, and it interacts with real-time shadow maps, so the light will dance between leaves and other objects in motion. It's pretty performant, especially with the downscaling, and it won't really have much impact on a modern GPU, but you probably won't have budget for it on the Switch or low-end PCs, so I definitely suggest tying this to your quality settings, and potentially falling back to a cheaper method if the light shafts are critical to your art direction. One really simple alternative would be to create light cards, and I'll show you what I mean. Beneath the chair here feels a little too brightly lit for me, and the ambient occlusion doesn't really have anything to latch onto to darken the floorboards here. We can really easily fix this by creating a shadow card, a simple plane with a basic gradient on it, and place this beneath the chair. Let's make it black and semi-transparent using the unlit particle shader provided by URP, and position it so it roughly feels like a shadow cast by the chair. I'll add a second angled card going up onto the wall behind the chair and enable soft particles on the shader to ease the transition into opaque surfaces like the wall and avoid those harsh edges. It's a simple little trick that lets us layer shadows to suit our vision and ground the chair into the scene, and you could totally do the opposite by making the card a warm orange and placing it in the window. This is an effect a lot of games use, but for lights that you're able to walk into, you'll have to go a little bit further with it to avoid some clipping issues and whatnot, especially if the camera can move through the card. Even with full volumetric lighting in Farewell North, I still wrote some light card shaders for using caves and indoor areas, which scroll a soft gradient texture in opposing directions across the card to add some motion as if the light is hitting dust particles in the air. I also gently fade the card out as you approach to avoid the camera clipping through it and let the volumetrics take over. We'll create some light cards later for the stylized scene, but volumetrics are perfect for this scene, so I think we can call it there. Let's finish off the lighting section with a simple lens flare using the provided lens flare SRP component. I've made a two-part flare composed of pentagons and a texture consisting of some blurred circles I created in GIMP. Again, if you just want to grab this and drop it into your project, all of this is in the Patreon repo. Alright, I'm sure we're all very sick of looking at this washed out scene, so let's finally get into some post-processing. I like to break this down into 3 segments: color grading, lighting, and artistic effects. You don't need a degree in the arts, but a very basic understanding of some fundamentals will really help you out. Color theory is one area in particular where you can get a lot of bang for your buck, and picking colors becomes a much simpler process when you understand how colors can play off one another and evoke an emotional response. This scene has a lot of blues and oranges in it, and that's no accident. These are one of the complementary color pairs, which are opposite colors on the color wheel. Complementary colors create a strong contrast and are generally pleasing to the eye, but there are many other color harmonies you can work with depending on how many colors you want and what you're trying to evoke. Flow Studio has a wonderful video on color theory for noobs, which I'd highly recommend checking out after this video to better understand how to use color. We do already have a color scheme we're happy with, but we can still do some color grading to give it some extra pop. Okay, the first thing that we're going to add is a tone mapper. Now, tone mapping is actually quite a deep rabbit hole to go down, but suffice to say that the Aces tone mapper is going to give us a more cinematic look, and it's going to add some much needed contrast to get rid of that washed out gray look that we have. Speaking of contrast, let's add some color adjustments. So I'm going to increase the contrast quite a bit here, and because it's so hard to know when to stop, I find the easiest thing to do is to go way too far with it, and then dial it back a bit until you get to an area that you're a little bit happier with. And we're also going to increase the saturation. We're going to do the same thing, go too far, and then bring it back a bit, and give it that kind of like warm, homey feel. Okay, let's close out the color grading with some shadows, midtones, and highlights. Now, if you don't know what this is, shadows, midtones, and highlights define these sections of the screen, or they divide up the screen by luminance. And you can see those limits defined down here. You can see this blue section of this chart here is defining what's considered a shadow, midtones are everything in the middle, and highlights are on the upper end. So if we highlight midtone adjustments and we bring that up, you're going to see all the sections of the screen that fall into this middle band of luminance are going to be raised or lowered as we want to. So what we're going to do is we're going to increase the midtones a little bit, and we're going to bring the shadows down just a little bit. It's a very subtle difference, but we're just adding a little bit of separation between the shadows and the midtones of the scene to make the shadows a little bit darker and the midtones a little bit brighter. Now there's a lot more you can do with color grading, but these are kind of my 3 go-tos that I use in pretty much every scene, and they act as a really good starting point. But let's move on to some lighting tweaks. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a vignette. I'm going to do a pretty soft vignette here, kind of low intensity, something like that, and pretty smooth. So what this is doing is just kind of darkening the edges of the scene, and it's kind of drawing our eyes into the center of the frame. Finally, everyone's favorite, we have bloom. So this is going to play really nicely with the volumetric lighting. I'm going to bring the threshold down a little bit, say like 0.5-ish, and increase the intensity. And what this is going to do is it's going to cause a little bit of an intentional blowout in the brighter areas of the scene, like the light is kind of scattering through the scene. And you can see that that plays really nicely with like the overexposed window and the volumetric lighting, and just kind of gives it a little bit more of like a dreamy look, which again kind of goes with the feel I'm going for here, that nostalgia feel. One of the biggest mistakes that people make when they discover post-processing is they go way too far with the bloom. You might even say that this has gone too far, but for the look I'm going for, this is actually what I want. But generally speaking, you want to kind of less is more with bloom, essentially. Now, bloom is also kind of an expensive post-processing effect, so one thing we can do, similar to what we did with the volumetric lighting, is we can downscale it and run it on a smaller resolution texture. So in this case, I'm going to go with half, and I'm also going to limit the maximum iterations a little bit. So like 4 or 5, maybe 5. And that's just going to reduce the cost of the effect, so we're not going crazy with the performance. Okay, finally, let's close out the post-processing with some artistic adjustments. The one artistic element I am going to go with is a film grain. Now this is going to be very, very subtle. You might not even be able to see it with YouTube, so I'm actually going to just crank it way up just so you can even see what I'm talking about. So you can see it adds this kind of graininess to the scene, right? This is way too far, but this is adding this graininess to the scene. And the purpose of that is to, again, kind of give this like old school kind of cinematic look, but it also has a practical benefit. So when your game is streamed or recorded on YouTube or Twitch or whatever, the compression is going to add a lot of color banding if you have a lot of like subtle gradients. The film grain can help add some noise and some texture to it to break up that banding, so it kind of acts as a bit of an anti-banding. It is definitely an artistic choice though. Not everyone loves film grains, so you could always put a setting to disable this if it's not important to your art direction. Personally, I like it for this kind of narrative-driven, cinematic kind of adventure game, so I'm going to include it. But again, it's an artistic choice, you don't have to. All right, looking good. So we've gone from this really flat, washed out gray environment with very little contrast to something that's much more punchy, it's much more contrasty, it kind of pulls you into the environment, has some emotional weight to it. There's like a hint of loneliness there. To me, this is kind of conveying our sense of nostalgia in this warm environment, much better than the washed out, low contrast version that we started with. Or maybe you want the scene to feel sad and we can reduce the contrast and shift to some bluer hues to evoke that. Post-processing carries a ton of weight, as long as you know the emotion you're trying to convey. There are plenty more effects that come stock with Unity, and it's really just a collection of shaders, so you can go wild writing your own post-processing shaders to get whatever look you're after, just like we did with the volumetric lighting. With all our lighting and post-processing in place, the scene is looking much better, but this mirror is really sticking out like a sore thumb. It's currently reflecting the blue skybox as if the house didn't exist. In order to get proper reflections, we need two things. On the material, I've maxed out the smoothness and increased the metallic, while enabling environmental reflections. There are no albedo or normal textures or anything, but I do still include the same detail inputs as I do on all the other surfaces to add a little bit of roughness and texture so it's not entirely flat. The second thing we need is a reflection probe. I've set this up in front of the mirror and baked it, which will render the reflected scene into a cube map, which is then sampled by any nearby materials with environmental reflections, such as the mirror. With that in place, we can see the reflections in the mirror, but we can also see some more subtle reflective properties on surfaces nearby, such as the banister and the wooden furniture. Even though these surfaces aren't as smooth and reflective as a mirror, this still helps tie the scene together and ground the objects into the world. Now, a lot of devs would stop here, but the scene is still too, well, still. That's to say there's no motion, and we can easily bring a lot more life and depth to it. This is where we can get really clever, finding places to add life to the scene. The easiest place to start is with some dust particles. I created a very simple VFX graph, which just initializes some tiny particles in a sphere around the camera with randomized velocity. It helps give the scene a little bit of added depth and starts separating it from a still image. Next up, the window is open and yet the curtains are completely still, so that's the next thing I want to improve. I whipped up a very quick shader in Shader Graph, just to show that you don't even need to know how to write HLSL to benefit from shaders. This shader runs a very simple sine wave over the curtains, taking the sine of time multiplied by some speed, which gives a value from -1 to 1, and acts as the wind strength for the current frame. We then multiply this by a wind direction that we define in world space, so we'll quickly convert that to object space and add it to the current vertex position. We now have some motion, but obviously the curtains shouldn't be going through the wall, so let's normalize the sine wave to be between 0 and 1. Better, but something still feels off. We probably want the curtain to have more movement towards the open window and be anchored at the top. Now, you don't necessarily need to learn 3D modeling and texturing if you just want to use assets, but I promise you that just a little bit of familiarity in Blender and Photoshop will pay huge dividends as a tech artist. I recommend spending a few hours one weekend just getting familiar with the tools, doing some tutorials, And then from there, just learn on the job as you make your game. I'm opening the curtains back up in Blender and painting the vertices so that they're red where we want motion and black where we want them to be still. The vertex color from the input geometry is then used in the shader, multiplied by the motion. If the red channel is black, then we'll get 0, and if it's red, we'll get 1, and that gradient will transition between full motion and stationary vertices. It's not a perfect cloth simulation by any means. There's a lot we could do to improve the wind animation, especially having it fold inwards a bit and adding some noise, but for a background decoration, it's a really quick win for 5 minutes of work. We finally have some life inside the house, but outside still feels static. We could start introducing some outdoor props, but I want the player's focus to stay indoors. I'm quite proud of this. I came up with a little idea which brings more motion into the house, but convinces you that there's motion outside. I started by creating an empty game object and added a whole bunch of child capsules, setting the renderer to only render shadows, randomly scattering them to create a sparse cylinder of these capsules. I wrote a very simple script to just infinitely spin the parent game object and place it outside the window. The effect is that we get this motion of shadows on the ground and a disruption of the light volumetrics, and you can imagine with some good sound design that this would make for a pretty convincing flock of birds. It is a bit repetitive if you stare, so I added a second group that spins in the opposite direction at a slightly different speed just to kind of break up the repetition. Of course, we could spend an entire afternoon writing a full Boyd simulation for realistic flocking behavior and set up vertex animation shaders similar to the curtains to create a very performant flying animation. But again, for 5 minutes of work, this buys us a lot of added life, and if the player can't see out the window with the bloom anyways, there's no real need to go much further than this. I am definitely known for getting a little bit carried away on the technical stuff, so I try to remind myself often to keep it simple and lean into the constraints of the world and the affordances that they offer you, until you really need the added complexity. There are always far more important things that you could be doing, so this is perfectly fine for now. So far we've focused on realism, with a dash of art direction to help us stand out. Now let's shift to our second scene and apply the same techniques to create a more stylistic art direction. With this scene, I'm going for a darker nautical theme, inspired by games like Control, where textures are minimal, and shape, light, contrast, and color take priority. This scene is pretty much using all the same techniques as the first, even the wind shader is getting some use on the dangling chains, the idea being that we're on a ship and simulating the swaying motion. There are a few major differences though, and this stylized look is going to make environments and props a whole lot easier to create. With this art style, I really wanted to avoid having to texture each object individually, which will save a ton of time not only in texture creation, but also in UV unwrapping, which is the process where we project a 2D image onto a 3D model. Instead, we'll use a very simple color palette texture for the whole world. Now, texturing an object is as simple as unwrapping the entire UV into the color from our palette. No need to think too hard about how to efficiently pack the UV, creating a texture per object, or any of that time-consuming stuff. And I think this actually looks pretty interesting already, with the lighting and the post-processing really doing the heavy lifting. But it's a bit too flat for my personal taste, so we'll multiply the palette color by a global noise to add a little bit of texture. Now I really don't want to bring back UVs for this, so I'm using a technique known as triplanar mapping to do this. This is a shader technique where we generate 3 UV coordinates based on the world position, one for each axis, and weigh each UV based on the normal vector of the current fragment. We can then sample the texture 3 times, and multiply each sample by the weight to get our final sample. Multiplying this noise by the color selected from our palette, and we have the final color. This seamlessly projects a repeating texture onto the object without having to unwrap UVs. And this really gives the world a lot more texture. I'm using the same surface imperfections texture we used in the realistic scene for the detail map, and tiling it throughout the entire world with our triplanar mapping. We can go one step further and triplanar map a normal texture on top as well, just to add a little bit more grittiness to the scene, and we're done. Now every object is using the same shader, and it can all be drawn in a single batch, which is super performant. The 3 samples per texture does have a cost, but we're more than making up for that with this batching, and in total we only have 7 texture samples across 3 textures, which is still pretty lightweight, even on devices like the Switch. Aside from that main shading change, there are a few smaller changes in the scene as well. In this scene, the volumetrics are based on SDFs, which approximate the shape of the lights. If you're not familiar with SDFs, then check out this video where I go over them in full, showing how I created the color effect from Farewell North. This is more efficient for many lights than sampling the shadow map of each, but the downside is that the shadows aren't considered, and there's more manual work per light to get the volume feeling right. This is definitely still a work in progress, but once it's ready, I'll be adding it to the Patreon code bundle as well. I'm also using light cards on the main spotlight to give it a more defined shape. This is a simple cone with a semi-transparent shader on top, and a noise texture scrolling across it to give it some movement and add some depth to the effect. I use 2, one larger and one smaller, to give the center of the light volume a little bit more brightness. To tie it all together and help mask some of the simplicity in the shading, I'm also using the built-in fog. I'm using a light blue to give a bit of a sense of cold and help with that nautical theme I'm going for. Thank you so much to all my patrons who voted on this video, and a special thank you to my Magpie supporters, and my Ospreys Elagon, Purple Slaw Studio, Jason Hansen, Elise Whaley, Raven Painted, and Justice Lind. Now of course, there's so much more we could do. decals and a wetness mask are two things which I think would be particularly helpful for this scene, but I hope that this video sparked some curiosity, showed you what you can do with a little bit of know-how and a dash of coding knowledge to bring your scenes to life and create striking visuals without necessarily needing to know 3D modeling or texturing. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.